Before vampires drank blood, ancient China feared something far colder. A corpse that did not rot. A body that could not walk, only hop. By night, it rose from the grave, arms outstretched, draining the very life energy of the living. No fangs. No seduction. Only imbalance made flesh. This was the Jiangshi, the stiff corpse that haunted villages, defied death, and terrified even Taoist priests. Tonight, we uncover the forgotten truth behind China's most unsettling undead legend, where history, belief, and horror collide. Thank you for watching, and welcome back to the channel. When the dead refused to lie still. Night in ancient China was not merely the absence of sunlight, it was a realm where order loosened its grip. Villages dimmed into silence, oil lamps flickered behind paper windows, and the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. It was in these hours, when dogs whimpered and the wind carried unfamiliar chill, that whispers began to spread. The dead were not staying dead. At first, the stories were small. A farmer claimed the body of his uncle had grown stiff far too quickly. A widow swore she heard something tapping outside her door, slow, hollow, rhythmic. Others spoke of graves disturbed without signs of digging, coffins found tilted, lids cracked from within. These were not tales told for entertainment. They were confessions, exchanged quietly, burdened with fear and shame. In a culture where honoring the dead was sacred, the idea that a corpse might rise was not only terrifying, it was an accusation. The creature blamed for these disturbances was called the Jiangshi, literally, the stiff corpse. Unlike the shambling dead of later Western imagination, the Jiangshi did not walk. It hopped. Its joints, locked by unnatural rigidity, forced its body forward in jerking bounds, arms extended as if forever reaching for something it could no longer possess. Witnesses described skin pale or tinged with green, breath frosting the night air, fingernails grown long and dark. The face bore no expression of hunger or rage, only vacancy. It was not a predator by desire, but by necessity. To the people of ancient China, this was not fantasy. It was a rupture in the natural order. Death, according to traditional belief, was not an abrupt ending. It was a transition governed by qi, the vital energy that animated all things. Qi flowed through the body in life, dispersed in death, and returned to the great cosmic cycle. When burial rites were performed correctly, when the body was laid to rest in harmony with the land, the transition was smooth. The dead became ancestors, protective, distant, benevolent. But when something went wrong, qi could become trapped. Improper burial, violent death, sudden trauma, deep resentment, or unfinished obligations could tether energy to flesh. In such cases, death did not complete its work. The body remained, stiff and tense, like a clenched fist that refused to open. This was the first stage of terror, a corpse that would not decay. Villagers learned to recognize the warning signs. A body that remained rigid long after death. Skin that did not sag or discolor as expected. Animals, especially dogs, refusing to approach the grave. Sudden cold drafts around the coffin. These were not coincidences, they were omens. Something had interrupted the natural flow between heaven, earth, and humanity. And when that balance fractured, the Jiangshi was born. Unlike later monsters that stalked with cunning, the Jiangshi was often described as blind or semi-aware, sensing life through breath and energy rather than sight. This made encounters even more frightening. Survivors told of hiding in doorways, pressing themselves flat against walls, holding their breath until their lungs burned as the corpse passed inches away. To breathe was to live, but to breathe was also to die. The Jiangshi did not feed on blood. It fed on qi. Those who survived its presence were left weak, pale, feverish, as if something essential had been drained from them. In eras before medical understanding, such symptoms were terrifyingly familiar. Illness appeared without wounds. Strength vanished overnight. Death followed silently. The Jiangshi became an explanation for disease, exhaustion, and sudden decline, especially during times of famine or plague. Fear spread fastest in the countryside. Rural villages were surrounded by mountains, forests, and burial grounds. Night was deep and absolute, unbroken by artificial light. A single sound carried far. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of something hopping across packed earth could freeze an entire household in place. Children were warned not to wander after sunset. Travelers avoided roads near graveyards. Doors were barred not against thieves, but against the dead. Yet the Jiangshi was not seen as pure evil. This distinction is crucial. In Chinese folklore, the Jiangshi was not a demon sent to punish the living. It was a symptom, a consequence. Its existence implied failure, of ritual, of respect, of harmony. To encounter one was not just bad luck, it was evidence that something, somewhere, had gone terribly wrong. This belief placed enormous responsibility on the living. Families were expected to perform burial rites with precision. Graves were aligned according to feng shui, ensuring proper flow of energy. Coins were placed in mouths. Mirrors were covered. Bells were rung. Every action mattered, because negligence did not merely dishonor the dead, it endangered the living. When a Jiangshi was suspected, panic alone could not solve the problem. This was the domain of Taoist priests, specialists in restoring balance. Armed with talismans inscribed with sacred symbols, peachwood swords believed to repel corruption, and incantations invoking celestial authority, they confronted the stiff corpse not as warriors, but as cosmic mediators. The goal was not destruction, but release, guiding trapped qi back into the proper cycle. But before any priest arrived, fear ruled. The idea that a loved one could become a Jiangshi was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of all. It meant that affection, obligation, and memory could curdle into danger. Death was no longer a boundary, it was a threshold that might reopen. In this way, the Jiangshi represented one of humanity's oldest fears, that the dead might return not because they hate us, but because they cannot leave. As the moon rose over tiled roofs and silent fields, people listened for sounds that should not exist. A knock without a hand. A shadow that moved wrong. A corpse that refused to lie still. And thus, long before science named decay and disease, ancient China gave shape to imbalance itself. A stiff body, trapped between worlds, hopping endlessly through the night. Death in the Chinese cosmological order. In ancient China, death was never understood as a sudden rupture between existence and nothingness. It was a transition, slow, regulated, and governed by laws as precise as those that moved the stars. Life, death, spirit, and matter were all expressions of a single substance, qi, the invisible breath that animated the universe. When qi flowed correctly, harmony prevailed. When it stagnated or fractured, disorder followed. The Jiangshi emerged from this worldview not as an aberration of horror, but as evidence that something in the cosmic process had gone terribly wrong. From birth to death, every human life was believed to exist within a vast cosmological system linking heaven, Tian, earth, Di, and humanity, Ren. This triad defined balance. Humans stood between celestial forces above and earthly forces below, tasked with maintaining harmony through ritual, morality, and proper conduct. Death, therefore, was not merely personal, it was cosmological. A single improper burial could disturb not just a family, but the energetic order of the land itself. At the center of this system was qi, which flowed through the body in cycles much like seasons through the year. Illness occurred when qi became blocked or excessive. Death arrived when qi naturally dispersed, returning to the greater cosmic reservoir. But ancient thinkers feared deaths that disrupted this process, violent deaths, suicides, executions, or burials conducted without ritual precision. In such cases, qi did not leave smoothly. It lingered, condensed, and corrupted. This residual energy was dangerous, capable of animating flesh that should have surrendered to stillness. Complicating this belief was the dual nature of the soul. Classical Chinese thought described two spiritual components, the hun and the po. The hun was light, ethereal, and yang in nature, associated with consciousness and destined to rise toward heaven. The po was heavy, corporeal, and yin, bound to the body and earth. At death, harmony demanded separation. The hun ascended. The po dissolved with the flesh. But when death was chaotic or emotionally charged, the po might remain trapped, tethered to the corpse. A body ruled entirely by yin, deprived of guiding yang, was vulnerable to reanimation. This imbalance was not malicious. It was mechanical. The Jiangshi was not a demon born of intent but a malfunction of spiritual physics. Too much yin energy pulled around a corpse, absorbed from moonlight, grave soil, or nearby decay, and the po, clinging desperately to matter, animated the body without awareness or compassion. What rose from the grave was not a soul returned, but a shell moved by instinctive hunger for qi. Rituals surrounding death were designed to prevent this catastrophe. Bodies were washed, dressed, and positioned according to precise cosmological rules. Coins were placed in mouths to stabilize breath. Mirrors were covered to prevent reflections from trapping spirits. Burial sites were selected using feng shui, ensuring the grave aligned with mountains, rivers, and wind patterns that encouraged the natural dispersal of energy. Even the timing of burial was calculated, chosen to avoid inauspicious celestial alignments that might trap yin energy near the corpse. Failure in any of these steps invited disaster. A corpse left unburied too long, a funeral interrupted, or a grave disturbed by animals or floods, all were believed to interfere with the soul's departure. Families feared not only grief, but responsibility. If a Jiangshi rose, it was not merely a monster, it was an accusation. Someone had failed the dead. This belief placed enormous social pressure on descendants. Ancestor veneration was not symbolic, it was practical. The dead required offerings, remembrance, and ritual maintenance to remain at peace. Forgotten ancestors were dangerous ancestors. In this way, Jiangshi law reinforced filial piety and continuity between generations. The living were caretakers of the dead, and neglect could quite literally return to haunt them. Taoist philosophy framed death as a return to the Tao, the natural way of all things. The Tao flowed effortlessly, without resistance. A proper death was one that surrendered to this flow. The Jiangshi represented resistance, qi that refused to dissolve, yin that accumulated beyond equilibrium. Taoist texts warned against clinging to life, wealth, or grudges, suggesting that emotional attachment could anchor the soul to the physical realm. The stiff corpse became a cautionary tale against excess desire, even beyond death. Importantly, Jiangshi were not omnipotent or cunning. They were blind to reason, driven by sensitivity to breath and warmth. This detail reflects cosmological belief. Without Hun, there was no intellect or moral awareness. What remained was appetite without understanding. The Jiangshi did not hate the living. It sought balance by stealing what it lacked, yang energy, from those who still possessed it. In this worldview, fear of death was less about annihilation and more about improper transition. Death done correctly preserved harmony. Death done poorly threatened the entire order. The Jiangshi thus stood as a liminal being, suspended between realms, embodying ancient China's deepest anxiety, that the universe was fragile and human error could tear its seams. Through this lens, the stiff corpse becomes something more tragic than terrifying. It is the result of imbalance, neglect, and cosmic misalignment, a reminder that in ancient China, even death required discipline. When that discipline failed, the dead did not sleep. They waited. The corpse that hops. To those who first claimed to see it, the most disturbing thing about the Jiangshi was not its face, nor its hunger, nor even the fact that it walked again after death. It was how it moved. It did not stalk its victims with measured steps, nor did it glide like a ghost. Instead, it advanced in stiff, unnatural hops, feet leaving the ground together, body pitching forward like a fallen statue pulled upright by invisible strings. Villagers said the sound came first, a dull, rhythmic thud against packed earth, growing closer in the darkness. By the time the shape emerged from the fog, terror had already taken hold. This peculiar motion became the Jiangshi's defining trait, but it was far more than a visual oddity. In ancient Chinese thought, movement revealed the state of harmony within a being. Grace meant balance. Fluidity meant life. The Jiangshi's hopping was proof of profound disorder. Stiffness after death. The explanation began with the body itself. After death, rigor mortis locked muscles and joints, transforming flesh into something closer to wood than skin. In ordinary circumstances, this stiffness faded as the body decomposed and returned to the earth. But folklore claimed that in certain cases, violent death, improper burial, or excessive yin energy, the rigidity never passed. A corpse that remained stiff was dangerous. It suggested that qi had not dispersed, that something vital remained trapped inside the flesh. Without the smooth circulation of qi through joints and meridians, the body could not walk as the living did. Thus, when reanimation occurred, movement became crude and mechanical. The corpse could only hop, propelled by residual energy erupting in brief, violent bursts. To ancient observers, this made terrible sense. Life flowed. Death stagnated. The Jiangshi moved like stagnation, trying, and failing, to imitate life. Arms outstretched toward the living. The posture of the Jiangshi was equally unsettling. Arms were locked straight ahead, fingers curled into claw-like shapes, nails long and darkened. This was not a gesture of attack in the human sense, but of imbalance. Without flexible joints, the corpse could not adjust its center of gravity. Its arms extended forward to prevent collapse, like a drowning man reaching for solid ground. Yet symbolically, this posture took on greater meaning. The Jiangshi was not reaching for flesh or blood, it was reaching for qi, the warmth and vitality it lacked. Its entire body leaned toward life because life was what it had lost. Stories warned that if a Jiangshi came near, one must not breathe. Breath was qi made visible, and the creature was drawn to it. Survivors described holding their breath as the corpse hopped past, feeling cold radiate from its body like winter itself had learned to walk. Blindness and sensory hunger. Many tales described Jiangshi as nearly blind. Their eyes were often clouded, half open, or fixed in a dead stare that did not track movement. Instead, they sensed the world through energy. Sound, breath, heat, these guided them far more than sight. This limitation made the hopping motion even more frightening. The Jiangshi did not chase. It advanced slowly but relentlessly, correcting its path with every thudding impact. Escape depended not on speed but on silence and stillness. Panic, shouting, or running drew its attention. In this way, the Jiangshi punished human instinct. Those who fled blindly died. Those who mastered fear survived. The sound of approaching death. Villagers said you heard a Jiangshi before you saw it. The rhythm was unmistakable: pause, thud, pause, thud. Dogs whimpered. Chickens went silent. The earth itself seemed to brace for impact. This sound became deeply embedded in cultural memory. It represented inevitability. The Jiangshi did not rush. It did not tire. Each hop carried it closer, no matter how long it took. Fear grew in the spaces between the sounds, allowing imagination to fill the darkness with horror far worse than the creature itself. To hear the hopping was to know that something had gone terribly wrong with death itself. Symbolism of broken harmony. In Taoist philosophy, walking is balance in motion, yin and yang alternating smoothly, weight shifting from foot to foot in harmony. The Jiangshi's movement violated this principle completely. Both feet struck the ground together. There was no alternation, no rhythm of opposites. Yin dominated absolutely. Thus, the hopping corpse became a living diagram of cosmic error. It embodied what happened when forces meant to flow instead froze in place. The Jiangshi did not just frighten people, it taught them. It was a lesson in what occurred when rituals were ignored, when death was rushed, when grief turned to obsession. From observation to legend. Some historians believe the hopping motion originated from misunderstood practices of corpse transportation. Bodies bound upright to bamboo poles could appear, from afar, to bounce along mountain paths. Carried at night to avoid alarming villagers, these processions cast long shadows that flickered like moving corpses. But folklore did not need to be accurate to be powerful. Once the image took root, it grew far beyond its origin. The hopping corpse became an icon, immediately recognizable, deeply unsettling, and uniquely Chinese. Fear without seduction. Unlike Western undead who lured victims through charm or beauty, the Jiangshi inspired fear through wrongness. Nothing about it was natural. Its movement alone signaled that something sacred had been violated. It did not tempt, it warned. Children were told, respect burial rites, honor ancestors, do not wander at night. The image of the hopping corpse enforced obedience more effectively than any sermon. It was horror with purpose. A corpse in motion, a world out of balance. Ultimately, the Jiangshi's hopping was not a limitation, it was a message. Each impact against the ground echoed humanity's failure to maintain harmony between life and death. The corpse did not hop because it wanted to. It hopped because it could not do otherwise. And in that stiff, relentless movement, ancient China saw its deepest fear reflected back, that death, mishandled, could become something far worse than life's end. The corpse that hops is not chasing the living. It is chasing the balance it lost, and will never regain. The Jiangshi as moral allegory. In the villages where the Jiangshi legend took root, the monster was feared, but it was also understood. Beneath the hopping corpse and talisman-pinned forehead lay a lesson older than the stories themselves. The Jiangshi was not merely a creature of terror, it was a moral allegory, a walking consequence of imbalance, attachment, and failure to live, or die, correctly. In this way, the Jiangshi belonged less to the realm of horror and more to the realm of ethics. Ancient Chinese storytelling rarely created monsters without purpose. Every demon, ghost, or restless spirit existed to illustrate a principle. The Jiangshi, stiff and graceless, represented what happened when a human life, or death, refused to follow the proper order of the universe. It was a warning wrapped in fear. At the heart of this allegory was attachment. Taoist philosophy taught that harmony came from alignment with the Tao, the natural way of things. To cling too tightly to wealth, power, grudges, or even loved ones disrupted that flow. Such attachments weighed down the soul. When death arrived, the spirit could not depart cleanly. The body remained anchored, heavy with unresolved desire. The result, folklore warned, was not peaceful ancestorhood, but reanimation, existence without purpose. Thus, the Jiangshi was often said to arise from those who lived wrongly rather than those who died violently. Greedy landlords, corrupt officials, obsessive scholars, and emotionally consumed mourners populated Jiangshi tales. These were not random victims of fate. They were people who had resisted impermanence. Death did not free them because they had never learned how to let go. This moral framing transformed fear into instruction. Children hearing Jiangshi stories learned that improper conduct had consequences beyond life. Adults were reminded that ritual was not empty tradition, it was ethical discipline. Burial rites, ancestor veneration, and seasonal offerings were acts of cosmic responsibility. Neglecting them invited imbalance, not punishment from gods, but disorder from the universe itself. The Jiangshi's physical traits reinforced this lesson. Its stiffness symbolized rigidity of character. Where living humans were expected to adapt, yield, and flow, the Jiangshi could not bend. Its locked joints mirrored inflexible thinking. Its hopping movement mocked progress, motion without advancement. In some stories, Jiangshi wandered endlessly, never arriving anywhere meaningful. This eternal stagnation was the ultimate moral failure in Taoist thought. Even the Jiangshi's method of feeding carried allegorical weight. By draining qi, it consumed vitality without giving anything in return. This mirrored exploitative behavior in life, those who took from others without balance. Just as the Jiangshi weakened the living, so too did selfish individuals weaken the harmony of society. The monster externalized social decay. Importantly, the Jiangshi was not portrayed as maliciously intelligent. It did not plot, seduce, or manipulate. It followed instinct, pulled forward by imbalance like gravity. This lack of agency reinforced a crucial idea: moral failure did not require evil intent. Simply living out of harmony was enough. The Jiangshi was what remained when intention no longer mattered, only consequence. Taoist priests, therefore, were not heroes in the Western sense. They did not slay monsters to prove dominance. They corrected errors. Their rituals resembled bureaucratic procedures, petitions, seals, and approvals within a celestial system. This reflected the Chinese worldview that morality was structural, not emotional. Order had to be restored, not avenged. One recurring tale tells of a Jiangshi that was finally subdued only after its family confessed long-hidden lies about inheritance theft. Once truth was spoken and restitution made, the corpse collapsed, finally lifeless. The lesson was unmistakable: social injustice could animate the dead. Harmony required honesty, not merely prayer. The allegory extended to grief itself. Excessive mourning, clinging to the dead, refusing acceptance, was believed to anchor spirits. Families were warned not to cry too loudly, too long, or too bitterly at graves. While this may seem harsh, it reflected a belief that love must respect boundaries. To refuse release was to trap both the dead and the living in suffering. The Jiangshi, then, became the embodiment of unresolved grief made monstrous. In times of plague or famine, Jiangshi stories intensified. Communities overwhelmed by death needed explanation. Rather than chaos, they chose narrative. The Jiangshi allowed suffering to be framed as imbalance rather than randomness. This gave people a sense of control: correct the rituals, restore harmony, and the horror would cease. Even fear became manageable when shaped into moral structure. Interestingly, the Jiangshi was also a mirror held up to authority. Tales circulated of corrupt magistrates returning as Jiangshi, hopping helplessly through the same villages they once exploited. These stories allowed moral critique without rebellion. Justice, folklore promised, operated beyond life. Power could not escape consequence. Over time, this allegorical function ensured the Jiangshi's survival. While other monsters faded, the stiff corpse endured because it evolved with society's anxieties. In modern retellings, the Jiangshi often symbolizes emotional numbness, social alienation, or cultural stagnation. It still hops, still moves without progress. In the end, the Jiangshi's true terror lies not in its claws or cold breath, but in its familiarity. It is not an invader from another world. It is what remains when balance is ignored. It is humanity's shadow, rigid, hungry, and unable to move forward. The moral is simple, yet unsettling. Live in harmony. Let go when the time comes. Or risk becoming something that cannot rest, cannot grow, and cannot truly exist, forever stiff, forever wandering, forever unfinished. Taoist priests and the art of control. In the shadowed villages of Qingyue, China, the Jiangshi was more than a frightening tale told to children. It was a very real danger, or at least, it was feared as such. And when fear took hold, the villagers had someone to turn to: the Taoist priest, the mediator between heaven, earth, and the restless dead. These priests were not mere storytellers, they were guardians of cosmic balance, trained in rituals, talismans, and spiritual warfare. To understand the Jiangshi, one had to understand how the Taoist priest wielded power over death itself. The Jiangshi was a creature of imbalance. Its rise occurred when the natural flow of qi, the vital energy permeating the body and universe, was disrupted. Death, according to Taoist thought, was the release of qi, a return to the Tao, the natural order of life and cosmos. When qi stagnated due to violent deaths, improper burials, or unresolved emotions, it could animate the corpse, tethering it to the mortal world. The Taoist priest's role was not to destroy the creature out of hatred, but to restore order, guiding the trapped qi back to its natural course. The tools of the Taoist priest. Taoist priests approached Jiangshi with a combination of ritual, symbolism, and psychology. Their arsenal was both practical and mystical. Fu talismans. The most famous tool was the Fu talisman, a square of yellow paper inscribed with complex Taoist characters, symbols, and incantations. These talismans were believed to harness celestial authority, compelling the Jiangshi to freeze or retreat. The priest would carefully affix the talisman to the corpse's forehead, chest, or sometimes even under its tongue, depending on the severity of the disturbance. The talisman's power was not magical in the way of Hollywood fantasy, it represented the cosmic authority of heaven itself, invoking forces beyond mortal comprehension. Peachwood implements. Another symbolically powerful item was the peachwood sword. In Chinese folklore, peachwood was believed to repel evil spirits and dispel yin energy. Priests wielded these swords to ward off approaching Jiangshi or to guide it into a controlled path, preventing harm to the living. Often, the sword would never physically strike the corpse. The mere presence of peachwood was enough to assert spiritual dominance. Mirrors and bells. Mirrors were used to reflect the corpse's own energy, creating confusion or trapping it within its own reflection. Bells, on the other hand, produced resonant sounds that disturbed the stagnant qi of the Jiangshi, temporarily immobilizing it. These tools, combined with ritual chanting, formed a carefully orchestrated strategy, containment rather than destruction, control rather than confrontation. Rituals of control. Taoist priests did not approach a Jiangshi casually. The rituals were elaborate, often taking hours to prepare. Before attempting any intervention, priests would cleanse themselves, the space, and sometimes even the villagers who had been in contact with the corpse. This purification was essential. The logic was simple: if qi could be disturbed by imbalance, then those performing the ritual must be in harmony themselves. The ritual often began with incantations, chants that called upon the celestial bureaucracy. In Taoist cosmology, the universe was organized like an imperial court, with the Jade Emperor at the top, judges of the dead, and countless spiritual officials overseeing order. The priest did not command the Jiangshi directly, he petitioned the bureaucracy to act. This concept is crucial. The Jiangshi was seen not as inherently evil, but as a civil servant gone rogue, a body animated by lawlessness. The ritual appealed to higher order, demanding compliance and restoration. Once the invocation began, the priest would present Fu talismans, mirrors, and peachwood in precise sequences, creating a controlled spiritual environment. Timing, posture, and placement were critical. A poorly executed ritual could provoke the Jiangshi, leading it to attack in its confused, hopping state. There are accounts of priests maintaining eye contact with the creature, stepping slowly backward, never turning their backs. Every move was deliberate, reflecting centuries of learned tradition. Taoist psychology, mind over corpse. Interestingly, the rituals also relied on psychological understanding. The Jiangshi's movement was guided by instinct and residual energy, it could not think or reason. Taoist priests exploited this limitation. By establishing dominance, using talismans as symbolic authority, and projecting calm confidence, priests could manipulate the corpse into stillness or retreat. In a way, the battle between priest and Jiangshi was less physical than it was symbolic, a performance of cosmic order over chaos. This psychological approach reflects broader Taoist principles. Taoism emphasizes balance, patience, and the natural flow of qi. Confrontation and force were last resorts. In dealing with the Jiangshi, priests were not warriors, they were conductors of harmony, orchestrating the return of the dead to the cycle they had disrupted. Every movement, chant, and talisman reinforced the natural order, demonstrating that even in fearsome situations, wisdom and alignment with cosmic law were paramount. Training and lineage. Not every Taoist could confront a Jiangshi. Expertise required years of study under a master, often passed down through lineage. Knowledge of sacred texts, incantations, celestial hierarchies, and physical ritual practice was essential. A mistake could result in injury, loss of life energy, or the spread of fear throughout a village. Stories survive of young priests attempting to intervene prematurely, only to find the Jiangshi hopping in fury behind them, talismans ignored, mirrors shattered, and bell sounds ineffective. These tales reinforced the necessity of skill, preparation, and respect. Villagers' role and ritual observation. Taoist priests often performed Jiangshi rituals in the presence of villagers. Witnessing the process reinforced social order and collective belief. Villagers learned that proper burials, respectful behavior, and adherence to ritual could prevent spiritual imbalance. In this way, priests were both spiritual and social authorities, maintaining cosmic order and ensuring communal compliance. Fear became a tool for moral instruction. Neglect ancestors, disrupt harmony, and the consequences would literally rise from the grave. Legends of famous Taoist exorcisms. Over centuries, countless legends circulated of priests confronting Jiangshi. One story tells of a priest in a remote village in Hunan province who immobilized a hopping corpse by placing a series of talismans in a spiral pattern, surrounding the Jiangshi and forcing it into containment until sunrise, when qi naturally returned to its cycle. Another recounts a Taoist priest confronting multiple Jiangshi simultaneously, using mirrors to confuse them and guiding them into a grave pit to prevent village harm. These tales, whether historical fact or folklore, illustrate a consistent principle: the Jiangshi could be controlled, but only through precise ritual and understanding of cosmic law. Feeding on qi, not blood. Unlike the European vampire, whose image is drenched in blood and lust, the Jiangshi occupies an entirely different, more chilling niche in Chinese folklore. These stiff corpses were said to feed not on crimson life fluid, but on qi, the vital life energy that flows through all living things, according to Taoist philosophy. To grasp the horror of this, one must first understand the centrality of qi in ancient Chinese thought. Qi was not merely metaphorical. It was tangible in the worldview of doctors, Taoist priests, and ordinary villagers alike. Qi governed health, mood, vitality, and even one's longevity. When balanced, it nourished the body and spirit. When depleted, it caused illness, despair, and death. A Jiangshi did not need to bite, pierce, or physically wound its victims. Its presence alone was enough. Folklore recounts that even standing in the same room as a Jiangshi could leave one pale and weak, as though their essence was being siphoned away. In some tales, people would awaken in the night to find their strength gone, unable to rise, trembling, or faintly burning with fever, an early cultural attempt to explain mysterious illnesses before germ theory existed. In villages where superstition and reality blurred, unexplained fatigue or sudden sickness was often blamed on a wandering corpse. This concept of life force consumption distinguishes the Jiangshi from its Western counterpart in a profound way. While European vampires operate on desire and consumption of blood, the Jiangshi is impersonal, almost mechanical in its feeding. It does not choose victims out of malice or pleasure, it acts according to imbalance. The undead body, animated by trapped yin energy or improper burial, seeks equilibrium by draining what it cannot generate itself, the qi of the living. This distinction underscores a cultural divergence in supernatural fear. In Western myths, the vampire is an intruder, corrupting the moral order through lust and blood. In Chinese law, the Jiangshi is a consequence of disorder, a mirror reflecting the consequences of neglecting ritual, morality, and cosmic harmony. Historical texts and anecdotal records contain striking accounts of Jiangshi encounters. One Qing dynasty tale describes a villager who noticed a greenish mist hovering near a recently dug grave. The mist slowly condensed into a stiff figure, hopping toward the house where the man lived. He felt an inexplicable drain on his energy, his limbs weakened, and he could barely speak. When a Taoist priest arrived and used a Fu talisman, a yellow paper charm inscribed with sacred symbols, the figure froze immediately, its qi disrupted by the ritual's counteracting force. This story, like many, emphasizes that the Jiangshi's power was subtle, pervasive, and terrifying precisely because it attacked something intangible, the invisible energy sustaining life. From a symbolic standpoint, feeding on qi reflects deeper fears of loss without visible cause. Disease, famine, or sudden death could strike communities seemingly at random. The Jiangshi became a narrative tool to personify these anxieties. It explained the unexplainable, why a family member might wither before their time, or why vitality seemed to vanish overnight. In essence, the creature transformed natural and social unpredictability into a story that could be understood, controlled, or at least confronted through ritual. The methodology of qi draining also influenced practical countermeasures. Villagers often slept with doors open, mirrors positioned strategically, and protective charms placed around the home. These actions were not just superstition, they were early forms of psychological reassurance. A house surrounded by talismans provided the illusion of control in a world where death was capricious and unstoppable. If a jiangshi did appear, the priest's intervention relied on restoring balance, rather than brute force. The talisman, chanting, or sword of peach did not kill the jiangshi, it merely blocked its ability to extract qi until the cosmic order was corrected. Interestingly, the jiangshi's diet of qi often led to nuanced stories of partial victimization. In some legends, a victim's life energy would be weakened but not entirely consumed. The result was a prolonged period of illness, pale skin, and constant fatigue. Such stories echo in modern Chinese medicine, where qi depletion is associated with chronic conditions like anemia, weakness, or insomnia. The jiangshi, in these narratives, operates as both a supernatural and didactic force, warning against neglecting the body, the spirit, or proper burial rites. The concept of qi consumption also illuminates the creature's interaction with other spirits and entities in Taoist cosmology. Unlike malevolent demons, jiangshi were bound to earthly imbalance. They were often neutral, neither inherently good nor evil, but their effect on humans was dangerous. A corpse reanimated prematurely or incorrectly became an energy parasite. Some legends describe these undead as attracted to the wealthy, healthy, or spiritually strong, as such individuals possessed more abundant qi. In a sense, the jiangshi represents cosmic justice, feeding on those whose energy imbalance is most visible, thereby correcting the imbalance left by improper death rituals. Modern interpretations have also examined jiangshi stories as allegories for psychological depletion. In tight-knit rural communities, overwork, stress, and grief were common. Tales of life energy theft metaphorically externalized the effects of these social pressures. A village facing famine might blame a jiangshi for the weakening of its children, translating suffering into a narrative with rules and solutions. The life force feeding motif, therefore, operates on multiple levels: spiritual, moral, and psychological. In cinematic depictions, the jiangshi's qi-based feeding has been creatively exaggerated. Films show corpses leaping toward villagers, their victims growing pale and drained within moments. While stylized, these portrayals retain a kernel of historical truth: the creature attacks vitality rather than blood. Even today, such stories inspire fascination and fear because they confront an intangible threat. The horror of being drained of one's essence resonates universally, even beyond the specifics of Chinese cosmology. In the jiangshi's consumption of qi, not blood, is a defining feature that sets it apart from other undead in global mythology. It reflects the Chinese worldview, where balance, ritual, and cosmic order dictate life and death. Qi, as both a literal and metaphorical life force, is central to understanding why the jiangshi terrified villages for centuries. Its attacks were invisible yet devastating, forcing the living to confront not only death itself, but also the unseen forces that maintain harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. In the jiangshi legend, the horror lies not in bite marks or spilled blood, but in the subtle, inexorable loss of the very energy that makes life possible, a fear as old as civilization itself. The role of yin energy. To understand the terrifying presence of the jiangshi, one must first understand the ancient Chinese concept of yin and yang, the complementary forces that govern the universe. In the Taoist worldview, all things, life, death, light, dark, warmth, cold, exist as a balance of yin and yang. Yin represents the passive, dark, cold, and feminine principle, while yang embodies the active, bright, hot, and masculine force. Life itself is a delicate dance between these energies, and death is no exception. A jiangshi is not merely a dead body, it is the embodiment of excessive yin, a corpse overpowered by the cold, passive, and decaying forces of the universe. When the natural flow of yin and yang is disturbed, qi, the vital life force that animates all beings, becomes unbalanced. Qi should circulate freely, dissipating at death to allow the soul to ascend and the body to return to the earth. When this does not happen, when the body becomes trapped in an excess of yin, the stage is set for the jiangshi. Yin energy is concentrated in darkness, in cold environments, and in places of death. Graveyards, abandoned homes, and mountains at night are rich in yin. This is why, according to folklore, jiangshi emerge primarily under the cover of night. Their hopping forms are a grotesque manifestation of yin dominance, a body no longer animated by the warmth of yang, yet still propelled by lingering energy. The corpse becomes rigid, pale, and cold, a vessel ruled entirely by the passive, decaying forces it embodies. The role of yin in creating a jiangshi also explains why these creatures are not entirely malevolent in traditional stories. They do not rise out of hatred or desire, they rise because their yin has overwhelmed the natural flow of life. In other words, a Jiangshi is not evil in the way a Western vampire might be, it is a cosmic accident, a physical manifestation of imbalance. This distinction is important. While Western tales often focus on moral corruption, Jiangshi legends emphasize the consequences of neglecting natural and spiritual order. Ancient Chinese texts describe several conditions that could lead to excessive yin in the corpse. One common belief was that those who died unnaturally, through violent death, suicide, or accidental injury, were more likely to rise as Jiangshi. Such deaths created unsettled qi, a residual energy that could not dissipate properly, allowing yin to accumulate. Similarly, improper burial rites could prevent the body from returning to the earth in harmony. For example, if the grave was misaligned with the flow of feng shui, or if the body was interred in soil that was either too wet or too cold, the corpse could retain excessive yin energy. Famine, disease, and plague also contributed to the mythology of yin-dominated corpses. In rural villages, where medical knowledge was limited and death often struck suddenly, a body that appeared unnaturally stiff or pale could inspire terror. In the absence of scientific explanations, the concept of yin provided a framework for understanding why some corpses did not decompose as expected. They were seen not merely as bodies, but as energetic anomalies, vessels overflowing with cold, passive force, desperate to restore balance by seeking out living qi. Taoist priests developed elaborate rituals to address the yin energy of a potential Jiangshi. These rituals were not designed to destroy the corpse out of hatred, instead, they were meant to rebalance the flow of qi. Priests would use fu talismans, sacred symbols inscribed on yellow paper, to immobilize the corpse temporarily. The talisman served as a kind of spiritual resistor, blocking the uncontrolled spread of yin energy. Mirrors were used to reflect and redirect yin, while bells and gongs were struck to harmonize the environment. Even swords carved from peach wood were believed to pierce the imbalance, forcing excess yin to disperse and allowing the corpse to finally rest. Fascinatingly, the role of yin also helps explain some of the more peculiar behaviors attributed to Jiangshi. For example, their hopping movement can be understood as a body entirely dominated by yin, rigid, cold, and incapable of the flowing motion associated with yang. Arms outstretched in front, they appear as if reaching blindly, guided not by consciousness but by the residual pull of living qi. Their faces, often depicted as pale green or bluish, symbolize the overwhelming coldness of yin, while their breath, visible in the night air, underscores the corpse's unnatural state, part of the world of the living, yet wholly removed from it. Yin's role also extended to the environment itself. Villagers believed that places saturated with yin, dark forests, graveyards, and abandoned temples, could amplify the power of a Jiangshi, making it more aggressive or difficult to contain. Conversely, introducing yang energy, through sunlight, fire, bells, or human warmth, could weaken the corpse, dispersing the accumulated yin and restoring cosmic balance. This interplay reinforced a central lesson of the legend: the living must respect both the laws of nature and the rituals of death to prevent the world from tipping into imbalance. Ultimately, the Jiangshi is a vivid illustration of yin's power, both feared and respected. It reminds us that in Chinese cosmology, death is not merely a physical process, it is an energetic one. When yin overwhelms the natural order, when rituals fail, and when life force is mismanaged, the result is not merely decay, but reanimation, a body that walks, or hops, as a warning to the living. The legend endures because it is more than horror, it is a meditation on balance, harmony, and the consequences of neglecting the unseen forces that shape life and death. In this way, yin energy is both the cause and the key to understanding the Jiangshi. It explains their rigidity, their nocturnal activity, and their unnatural hunger. It also offers a moral lesson: the universe demands balance, and even in death, those who fail to honor this principle may find themselves trapped, stiff and hopping, between worlds. And perhaps that is why, centuries later, the Jiangshi remains one of the most haunting symbols of Chinese folklore, a creature born not of evil intent, but of cosmic imbalance, a stiff corpse that reminds the living of the invisible forces that govern all existence. Signs a corpse might rise. In the villages and mountains of ancient China, death was never a purely private affair. The process of dying, burial, and mourning was deeply intertwined with cosmic order. The people believed that improper care or disrupted rites could disturb the delicate flow of qi, the life energy that sustained both body and spirit. When this energy remained trapped, the corpse risked returning to the world of the living, not as a resting ancestor, but as a Jiangshi, the stiff, hopping corpse feared by generations. The stories of rising corpses were often passed down through whispered warnings. Villagers spoke of strange occurrences surrounding certain deaths, as if the environment itself were signaling that something was amiss. Animals behaved unusually, dogs howled into the night, cats hissed at empty corners, and birds avoided certain graves altogether. It was said that creatures attuned to qi could sense its stagnation, warning the living that a soul was trapped, teetering on the edge between life and death. One of the most commonly cited signs was the corpse itself. A body that refused to decay raised immediate suspicion. Unlike ordinary corpses, which softened and lost rigidity within days, a Jiangshi candidate remained unnaturally stiff, its limbs locked in place. This abnormality was often exacerbated by cold weather, which slowed decomposition and mimicked the signs of life. The villagers interpreted this rigidity not as a natural process, but as evidence that the soul remained tied to the body, unwilling, or unable, to leave the mortal realm. Eyes were another significant indicator. In many accounts, the dead seemed to open their eyes posthumously, or even appear to watch their surroundings during burial rituals. While modern observers might attribute this to natural relaxation of muscles or environmental factors, in the folk imagination it was a terrifying omen. An eye that followed the living was considered a direct manifestation of residual qi, an energy that could later animate the corpse. Those who witnessed such phenomena often fled, leaving the corpse to the careful attention of ritual specialists. Nails and hair growth also played a role in the superstitions surrounding rising corpses. Unlike the slow, observable processes of decomposition, villagers believed that fingernails and hair continued growing after death, reaching abnormal lengths. This sign was interpreted as the body hoarding life force, a physical expression of qi refusing to depart. Families became alert when nails curled unnaturally or hair appeared unusually thick after burial. In extreme tales, the appearance of long, claw-like nails was said to foreshadow the corpse's nocturnal excursions. Other signs involved more subtle environmental cues. Unexplained cold drafts or sudden chills in the room of a deceased person were considered warnings that qi was disturbed. Likewise, certain deaths produced unnatural smells or mists, especially in poorly ventilated homes or crypts. Folk traditions often linked these phenomena to emotional unrest, a violent death, a grudge held by the deceased, or fear and anger unresolved at the moment of passing could manifest as disturbances in the surrounding air. Such occurrences were viewed not merely as spooky coincidences, but as signals that intervention was required to prevent a corpse from rising. Some of the most vivid warnings came from interactions with animals. Dogs, particularly sensitive to qi in folklore, were said to refuse to enter rooms where the corpse was restless, barking or growling at invisible presences. Cats, by contrast, might be drawn to the corpse but react aggressively, hissing and scratching at nothing tangible. Livestock could fall ill or refuse food in response to lingering, imbalanced qi, further alerting villagers to the need for precaution. Animals, in this sense, acted as both harbingers and detectors of supernatural disturbance, a natural early warning system recognized in both myth and practical rural life. To prevent potential reanimation, villagers employed numerous preventative measures. Small, symbolic rituals often sufficed for minor disturbances, while serious warnings required the expertise of Taoist priests or local shamans. Families might place coins, rice, or other objects in the mouth of the deceased, believed to absorb lingering qi or anchor the spirit in the proper direction. Clothing was pinned, sometimes with charms sewn into the lining, to restrict movement. Mirrors, another common tool, were positioned to reflect the body away from the house, preventing it from leaving its resting place uninvited. Even the timing of burial could serve as a warning or protective measure. Certain days, according to the lunar calendar, were considered unlucky for burial. A corpse interred during these times was thought more likely to become a jiangshi. Similarly, improper placement of the grave, facing the wrong direction or ignoring the principles of feng shui, could trap the spirit in the physical world. Villagers paid meticulous attention to these signs, not out of mere superstition, but because balance was believed to be essential to both spiritual and social order. Interestingly, some legends describe behavioral warnings before death. Individuals who displayed unnatural fear, anger, or obsession with wealth at the end of life were often suspected of becoming jiangshi if they passed away. The moral dimension here is critical. The stories reinforced proper conduct, both in life and death. A corpse was more than a body, it was a reflection of the soul's harmony or discord. In a way, the signs of a rising corpse served dual purposes. On one level, they were practical methods for identifying potential danger, allowing communities to take ritual precautions. On another, they were symbolic reminders of human responsibility. the dead were not entirely beyond influence, and the living carried the burden of ensuring cosmic and familial balance. The fear of Jiangshi, therefore, was not mere horror, it was a philosophical teaching, illustrating that actions, emotions, and unresolved conflicts could echo far beyond a single lifetime. As night fell in villages across ancient China, families remained vigilant. Every stiffened limb, every inexplicable chill, every animal's warning was a signal to act. Sometimes, intervention was as simple as the careful placement of charms or ritual recitation. Other times, the expertise of a Taoist priest was required, someone trained in the delicate art of returning trapped qi to its proper course. In every case, the signs of a rising corpse were a reminder that life and death were interconnected, and that neglecting one could endanger the other. Even today, the folklore survives in tales of villages abandoned due to restless spirits, in the myths told to children at night, and in films that dramatize the terror of hopping corpses. The warnings, as vivid as they were centuries ago, continue to capture the imagination, illustrating a culture deeply attuned to the unseen forces of the universe. The signs a corpse might rise were never mere superstition, they were a window into the fears, philosophies, and cosmology of ancient China. Fear in the countryside. In the quiet countryside of ancient China, nightfall was never simply the absence of sunlight. It was a signal, a threshold into a world where the living and the dead could brush too closely against one another. Villagers returned home along narrow dirt paths, their lanterns flickering against the encroaching darkness. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, was enough to make hearts race. And when tales of the Jiangshi began circulating, fear settled over the rural landscape like a thick, impenetrable fog. The Jiangshi, known as the stiff corpse, was a creature of whispers. Unlike other monsters that might strike with claws or fangs, the Jiangshi's threat was insidious, subtle, and relentless. It did not chase for sport or pleasure, it wandered, propelled by trapped qi, seeking to draw life force from the living. Its hopping gait, awkward, jerky, unnatural, became a signature that made the creature instantly recognizable in both myth and memory. To the peasants, these were not merely stories for the hearth, they were warnings rooted in lived experience. A neighbor's uncle might have fallen ill mysteriously after walking near an abandoned grave, or an animal could be found dead in the fields, its energy seemingly drained. Each incident fed the legend, embedding the Jiangshi into daily life. In regions where superstition blended seamlessly with the rhythms of survival, the fear of Jiangshi shaped routines. Children were forbidden from wandering after sunset, lest the hopping corpses mistake them for sources of qi. Families would secure doors and windows with wooden stakes or hang yellow talismans inscribed with Taoist symbols. Farmers returning from distant fields sometimes carried peachwood charms, believed to repel malevolent spirits, including the restless dead. And yet, the fear was not only practical, it was psychological. The Jiangshi embodied the villagers' dread of the unknown, the reminder that death was not always final, and that imbalance in life could ripple far beyond the grave. One of the most persistent fears was hearing the faint, rhythmic thud of a hopping corpse at night. Unlike wolves, which could be seen and understood, or bandits, who left tracks and motives, the Jiangshi's movements were silent and deliberate. Villagers described hearing the strange, unnatural thumping of its rigid limbs across stone paths, sometimes far from the nearest cemetery. At first, they thought it was an animal, or perhaps the wind playing tricks. But in areas steeped in folklore, these sounds were immediately identified as the approach of a Jiangshi. The fear was as much about the inevitability of encountering such a creature as it was about the creature itself. To meet a Jiangshi was not simply to face danger, it was to confront the breakdown of natural order, a corporeal symbol of death's refusal to obey its laws. Animals were sensitive to this imbalance long before humans took notice. Dogs would bark incessantly at empty fields. Cats would refuse to enter certain rooms or corners of the house. Even livestock sometimes stopped eating near grave sites, instinctively avoiding spaces believed to attract the restless dead. Villagers interpreted these behaviors as signs of pending visits from the Jiangshi. In a society heavily reliant on agricultural survival, the ability to read such omens could mean the difference between life and death, making superstition a practical as well as psychological necessity. Over generations, these small, daily precautions became traditions, talismans at thresholds, protective chants during funerals, and strict adherence to burial rites. The Jiangshi also served as a kind of moral enforcer, particularly in rural communities where harmony, respect for elders, and adherence to ritual were paramount. Those who neglected ancestral rites or displayed disrespect for the dead were seen as more likely to attract the attention of these undead creatures. The legend reinforced social norms and behaviors by linking moral conduct to tangible consequences. If a person failed to honor their ancestors, not only did they risk spiritual imbalance, but the village itself might suffer the repercussions, for a restless corpse could wander at will, potentially harming anyone in its path. In this way, the fear of Jiangshi was both communal and personal, binding society together under the shared weight of superstition and moral responsibility. Stories of encounters in the countryside were both cautionary and vivid. One tale described a young farmer walking home after a late harvest. The moon had not yet risen, and shadows stretched long across the fields. He paused when he heard a faint thump behind him. Turning, he saw a pale figure hopping toward him, arms rigidly extended. Frozen with terror, he remembered the instructions his grandmother had whispered: "Do not breathe, do not panic, and the Jiangshi will pass." Holding his breath and pressing against the mud wall of a nearby house, he remained still as the stiff corpse hopped past, drawn elsewhere by stronger qi. Such stories, whether exaggerated or literal, reinforced a culture of vigilance, patience, and awareness, vital skills for survival in the often harsh countryside. The Jiangshi also influenced funerary practices. Villagers went to great lengths to prevent the dead from returning. Bodies were buried quickly, with headstones aligned according to feng shui principles, ensuring proper energy flow. Charms and incantations were often placed on or around graves. In some regions, the dead were carried upright on bamboo poles when transported over long distances to avoid disturbing the energy around them. These practices were not simply superstitious, they reflected a deep understanding of the cultural and psychological importance of ritual, as well as a symbolic acknowledgement of the power of the Jiangshi. Each ritual was a safeguard against imbalance, a measure of control over the chaotic forces represented by death. Even as China modernized, these tales persisted in villages, sometimes mingling with new beliefs and media. Films and literature adapted the hopping corpse into stories of horror and humor, but in the countryside, the ancient fear retained its potency. The Jiangshi was more than a legend, it was a presence, a manifestation of villagers' anxieties about mortality, morality, and the fragile boundary between life and death. Its hopping gait, pale skin, and relentless pursuit of qi symbolized the consequences of neglecting harmony and tradition, reminding rural communities that fear itself could be as instructive as it was terrifying. By weaving fear into everyday life, the Jiangshi became an inseparable part of the countryside's cultural landscape. It was a creature of both caution and story, ensuring that rituals were observed, ancestors were honored, and the balance between yin and yang remained intact. In this sense, the stiff corpse was not merely a monster to be avoided, it was a teacher, an enforcer, and a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities of human society. The origins of the legend. The story of the Jiangshi did not emerge fully formed from folklore. Like all enduring myths, it grew from a mixture of observation, ritual practice, and fear. To understand its origins, we must leave the comforts of modern understanding and step into the villages and mountains of ancient China, where life and death were governed by forces invisible yet profoundly real: qi, yin and yang, and cosmic balance. The earliest recorded references to reanimated corpses appear in texts from the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, though the Jiangshi as we recognize it, hopping, stiff, energy-draining, became prominent during the Qing dynasty, 1644 to 1912 CE. In Han-era writings, accounts often describe restless spirits or corpses that moved unnaturally, usually to warn the living or enact vengeance. These narratives, however, were largely spiritual or moral in nature. They emphasized the consequences of improper conduct in life and neglect in death. The Jiangshi legend, by contrast, fused spiritual anxiety with the tangible fears of death, disease, and the unseen world, creating a physical manifestation of metaphysical imbalance. One of the most practical roots of the legend comes from the custom of corpse transportation. In times past, it was common for people who died far from home, especially merchants, soldiers, or officials, to have their bodies returned to their ancestral village for burial. The journey could last days or even weeks. To preserve the corpse, the body was often tightly bound and carried upright on bamboo poles, sometimes wrapped in layers of cloth and occasionally propped in coffins that allowed little movement. In the dim light of night, villagers observing distant silhouettes of these moving bodies may have seen figures hopping or swaying along mountain paths. The image of a stiff, upright corpse moving unnaturally could easily spark fear and imagination, giving rise to early descriptions of the Jiangshi. The rigor mortis theory aligns with this observation. Ancient people lacked the scientific understanding of post-mortem physiology. A corpse that stiffened soon after death, with limbs locked in unnatural positions, would appear almost alive, but wrong, defying the natural order. The body could not walk smoothly, it could only move in awkward, jerking motions. These movements, combined with the eerie stillness of death, created the iconic visual of the Jiangshi, arms outstretched, hopping forward, face pale and ghastly, clothing sometimes tattered or traditional burial garb, long nails glinting under moonlight. The corpse was no longer simply dead, it became a symbol of cosmic disruption. Beyond physical explanations, Jiangshi legends are deeply intertwined with Taoist cosmology and burial practices. Death, according to Taoist belief, is not an end but a transition. Life force, or qi, must flow harmoniously from body to earth to the cosmos. If burial rites were improper, if the corpse was left unguarded, or if the deceased harbored strong attachments, anger, desire, or resentment, qi could stagnate. This imbalance could prevent the spirit from ascending, leaving the body animated by residual energy. Villagers recognized this as a form of divine punishment or cosmic error, a tangible manifestation of spiritual disharmony. Stories of Jiangshi often reference unsuccessful exorcisms or neglected rituals. For instance, in some tales, a man dies far from home, and his family rushes to bury him quickly to avoid disease or ritual impurity. But they fail to observe all the proper rites: no offerings of food or coins, no chanting to guide the spirit, no placement of talismans to protect the body. That night, the corpse rises. Villagers report hearing banging, thumping, or hopping sounds as the body moves unnaturally, heading for the living. The legend thus served as both warning and moral instruction: honor your ancestors, observe proper rituals, and maintain cosmic balance. Interestingly, some Jiangshi tales likely grew from practical fears of disease. Epidemics were common, and contagion was poorly understood. A neighbor dying suddenly could inspire rumors of restless corpses, especially if others became sick soon after. The idea that a corpse could drain life energy was an attempt to explain sudden illness. In this way, Jiangshi stories functioned as early epidemiological warnings, disguised as supernatural horror. The legend also absorbed elements from Chinese military folklore. During wars, corpses of fallen soldiers were often left on battlefields or transported hastily. Soldiers told stories of fallen comrades rising in the night, moving stiffly, driven not by malice but by residual energy. These tales reinforced the Jiangshi's association with ritual error and the consequences of improper respect for the dead, bridging the gap between village superstition and real-life wartime anxiety. By the Qing dynasty, these threads, corpse transport, rigor mortis, Taoist belief, moral instruction, disease fears, and military law, wove together into the Jiangshi narrative we recognize today. Tales spread through rural communities, eventually appearing in literature, opera, and storytelling. Each region added its own flavor. Some Jiangshi were mindless, others retained partial memory, and a few were even used to teach children about obedience, respect, and ritual conduct. Their hopping motion, a combination of physical stiffness and supernatural energy, became the defining characteristic. The Jiangshi's emergence also reflects broader Chinese attitudes toward death. Unlike Western cultures, where death is often hidden or sanitized, ancient Chinese society engaged deeply with mortality, integrating it into everyday life. Ancestor worship, feng shui, grave placement, and ritual offerings created a framework where the dead remained present but controlled. A Jiangshi represented the violation of this framework, a corpse untethered from both family and cosmic order. Fear of the Jiangshi was thus fear of chaos, the terror of a world where spiritual rules failed and death became unpredictable. In summary, the origins of the Jiangshi legend are neither simple nor singular. It arose from a blend of practical observation, cultural ritual, and moral storytelling. The sight of a stiff corpse traveling at night, bound for proper burial, became myth. The understanding of qi, yin, and yang imbued it with metaphysical weight. And the anxieties of disease, improper ritual, and social disruption gave it purpose. The Jiangshi was never just a monster, it was a warning. A reminder that when balance is broken, even death can go wrong. Across ancient China, people feared not the corpse itself, but what caused it to rise: forgotten rituals, unresolved lives, and energy trapped between worlds. And perhaps that fear still lingers today. If you enjoyed this journey into ancient horror and forgotten mythology, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Your support keeps these stories alive. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious, and stay in balance.